Thank you, Nancy, for that song. It's a really appropriate song for today because we're gonna talk about why it's so important that the shepherd is with us, even when we don't maybe understand that, when we go through things in life that we don't really understand. And for us to see that, here's what I'm going to ask you to do this morning as we begin. I know for some of you this will be a little harder than for others, but I want you to think back to when you were a child. And I want you to think about when you went to bed at night and you got into your room and your parents tucked you all in and then they turned the lights out. And then, did you ever get scared when you were a kid? I mean, and there's a lot of things we could be scared of. We could be scared of maybe a shadow outside the window. We could be afraid of the wind blowing and something blowing up against the window. Here in Tucson this time of year, you might get afraid because there's a thunderstorm outside and there's lightning and there's thunder. And if you think about all those times when you got scared as a child, what was it that would calm those fears? What was it that would alleviate those fears? I think for most of us, we'd say it was probably our parents, wasn't it? It was the presence of our parents, our confidence in them. Them just being with us in the midst of that, whether that meant us jumping into bed with mom and dad, or whether it just meant we knew they were in that next room and we could count on them and we could rely upon them. And I think that's how we deal with our fears in this world as well. But not just with our confidence in our parents, with our confidence in God. And we still have fears, don't we? Even when we grow up, we still have fears. Now, some of those fears are kind of like the ones we had when we were a little kid. Sometimes they can be kind of imaginary. Sometimes they aren't real, but there are real fears out there. I mean, for some of you guys that are students in school, and maybe you're struggling with your schoolwork, or maybe someone's bullying you on the playground, that's a real reason to have fears, isn't it? Maybe you go to work one morning and your boss calls you into their office and they tell you that they're laying you off or they're firing you. Now, there's a real reason to have some fears about that, isn't there? Maybe your car's starting to make a funny noise, or maybe the check engine light comes on. And you realize that, man, I don't have enough money in my account to pay for whatever repairs that might require. And that could be a real fear. I mean, there's a reason for that fear. You go to the doctor, and the doctor tells you that you have cancer. Is there a reason to fear? Of course there is. That's a real fear that we ought to have. And when we have all those kinds of fear in our lives, we can try to find security in the midst of those fears in all kinds of different places. We might try to find that security in another person, maybe our spouse or a parent or somebody else, some other person. We could try to find our security in drugs or alcohol or gambling or sex or some kind of other addictive behavior that we get involved in. Sometimes we could try to find our security in a weapon or a home security system. Now, once again, as I hope I've made it clear all throughout this series, I'm not suggesting that we don't take advantage of some of those things in our life. Some of those are prudent steps to take. But here's what I am saying. None of those things are going to provide lasting security. None of those things are going to be a complete antidote to your fear because they don't deal with the root problem of your fear. So this morning, as we look at Psalm 23, verse 4, we're going to see what is God's antidote for the fear in my life. And here's what we're going to find this morning. That true security is not found in the absence of dangers, but rather in the presence of the shepherd. Think about that for a moment. True security is not found in the absence of dangers, but it's found in the presence of the shepherd. I think that's what David is saying in Psalm 23, verse 4. Here's what he writes. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Man, if anyone knew what it meant to walk through dark valleys, David knew that. He had a lot of those dark valleys in his life. And there's a pretty good chance that when he was writing this particular psalm, he was going through one of those dark valleys. And yet, what did David do? David looks back over his life. He looks at all these dark valleys. And he says, you know what? The reason I was able to walk through those valleys and not be afraid and not fear evil, he said, is because during those darkest times, the shepherd was there present with me. So this morning, we want to look at how we can make sure that the shepherd is present with us when we walk through those dark valleys. I'm going to take a little different approach this morning. Rather than going through this verse in detail, I just want to jump right into the applications that we can make this morning. And as we do that at the appropriate points, I'll kind of stop to look at some of the details of the verse. So how do I make sure that I can experience God's presence in my valleys? 4 things I want to share with you this morning. The first one is this: don't be too eager to avoid valleys. I mean, the truth is, most of us would like to avoid those valleys, wouldn't we? Wouldn't you like to just live on the mountaintops all the time and have God just like bring a helicopter down and pluck you off one peak and take you to the next peak, and then when you got done there, take another helicopter trip over to the next one? But life doesn't work like that in reality, does it? It's really interesting. As I've shared with you, I've been reading this book by Philip Keller called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. And in that book, he talks about how shepherds in Palestine in the spring, as things would begin to thaw and the spring would come in, that the shepherds would take their sheep from where they'd been hunkering down in the winter, probably in the lowlands. Usually they were in a pen around the shepherd's house. And he would take his sheep and he would take them up to these mountaintops where they were going to live for the summer because there was abundant feed up there for them. But in order to get to those mountaintops, what did they have to do? They had to go through the valleys to get there. I mean, think about it. Even today, if you want to drive to the top of Mount Lemmon, if you take that road, what does it do? It follows the valleys. It doesn't just go straight up the mountain because you couldn't do that. The same thing was true for the sheep. Not only that, but those valleys are where the rivers and streams flowed that provided water for the sheep and where the grass would grow so they could eat on their way up to those mountaintop experiences. So that was really the only practical way that the sheep could get up to those mountaintops. And what David is telling us here is that in our lives, it's also necessary for us to go through some valleys. Look what he writes, the first words there: even though I walk through the valley. With those 2 little words, David makes very clear to us that we are going to walk through valleys. He doesn't say, if I walk through the valleys. He says, even though I walk through the valleys. They're to be expected in our lives. Last week we talked about these paths of righteousness that the shepherd has set out for us. And guess what? He talks about those paths of righteousness in verse 3, and then at the beginning of verse 4, what does he say? Sometimes those paths require us to walk through valleys. God has ordained that to be the case. He's made that our lives to work like that, so we don't just go from mountaintop to mountaintop. The Bible is clear over and over again that that's the way things are. I think sometimes we've been sold this bill of goods that says, man, just become a Christian, just follow it, make Jesus your shepherd, and the valleys will all go away, or God will kind of smooth those out. But the Bible never promised that. God never promised that. Matter of fact, if you look through the Scriptures, He's promised exactly the opposite. He's promised that there will be valleys, that we ought to expect them. One of my favorite passages in the entire Scripture is Isaiah 43. And it begins with these words in verse 2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. Notice I highlighted the word when there. Again, it doesn't say if, it says when. And what's the neat thing, and we don't have time to really look at this, but what God promises in those verses, that when we go through those valleys, what is He going to do? He's going to be with us. The shepherd will be present with us there. So He says, when you go through these valleys, because they're going to come in life. How about Jesus? Jesus told us that we'd have valleys. John 16:33, Jesus said this, in the world you might have tribulation. Is that what He said? No, he said you will have tribulation. Again, Jesus warned all his followers. He said, if you live while you're living in this world, there's going to be tribulation, there's going to be valleys, there's going to be problems in your life. James confirms the same idea. James chapter 1, verse 2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when, there's that word when again, you meet trials of various kinds. James takes it a step further, doesn't he? He not only says when you face trials, he says when you get in those trials, when you get in the valleys, count it all joy. How do you do that? We're going to talk about that a little bit. Why we're to do that and how we're to do that as we go through this psalm this morning. But for now, let me just say this. You know what? Those valleys that God puts there, they're often the very best, and they're often the shortest way for God to get us to where He wants us to be. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. This last week, Pam and Derek and their kids went up to the White Mountains with some other families. And if you want to go up to the White Mountains from Tucson, the shortest way to get there is you go through a big valley called the Salt River Canyon. Well, there was another family going with them that for some reason didn't want to drive through the Salt River Canyon. So they decided they would take a shortcut and go through Morenci and avoid the Salt River Canyon. The only problem was it took them 2 hours longer than everyone else to get there by taking the shortcut. Because they didn't want to go through the valley, they ended up taking a whole lot longer to get to their destination. And I think that's a picture of what happens in our lives sometimes. We do everything we can to avoid the valleys that God has set forth for us. And what we find is that it just takes longer for us to get to that destination where God wants us to be in the first place. Notice what David writes here. There's two really important words here. He says that he walks through the valley of the shadow of death. He walks through them. Two important things that those words communicate to us. First of all, it communicates that valleys are only temporary. He walks through them. He doesn't stay there. The valleys that God usually brings into our lives, we stay there for varying lengths, but they're temporary. God never intended for us to live there permanently. Second thing I think is important, it says that he what? Walked through the valley. He didn't run through the valley. He walked through the valley. He didn't try to hurry and get through it faster than God wanted him to do. And I think when you think about those words, it helps us to understand that there are two extremes that we need to avoid when it comes to the valleys in our life. On one hand, we can just hang around in those valleys and stay there longer than we need to. And don't you know some people like that maybe around you? They almost seem to enjoy living in the valleys. And I guess there can be a lot of different reasons for that. But ultimately, I think they do that because it somehow brings attention to them, that they can always be in this place where they're saying, oh, woe is me, I'm going through this other valley, and it kind of brings attention to them. So we don't want to just wallow there. And it also means that, guess what, sometimes we don't get into valleys because God put us there. We get there because we did something stupid in our life. We made a mistake. We committed some kind of sin. And when that happens, we don't just have to hang out and remain there. We ought to get out of there. Or sometimes God brings valleys that we ought to get out of. And it takes wisdom to know that. So we don't want to just hang out and wait in the valleys there. But on the other hand, we don't want to try to get through those valleys too quickly or to go around them. You know what happens when we do that? We get in a hurry. And in trying to get out of that valley, what usually happens is we slip and we fall right back down in that same valley and we have to go through it all over again. So it requires wisdom from God to understand when we get in those valleys that we don't want to stay there too long, but we also don't want to be too eager to avoid them or to get out of them too quickly. That's because our security is not found in the absence of dangers, but rather in the presence of the shepherd. And that means that we have to be careful not to to get too eager to get out of those valleys too quickly. The second thing that I have to do if I want to make sure that I experience the presence of the shepherd in those valleys is to understand that every valley is a path to something better. Every valley is a path to something better. I mean, think about it sometimes. You think about, God, I mean, Jesus died on the cross for me. He went through this tremendous valley so to provide for my sins. Why would a shepherd that loves me so much, why would he want me to go through these valleys in life? And the only real answer that's out there is because he wants to lead me to a better place. That's why the shepherd takes me through valleys. Think about the sheep. For the sheep, a valley was a dangerous place for them to be. That's where the predators had the easiest access to them. Think about it, as they go down through these valleys, and I've talked to some of you guys that hunt out there, and you guys have seen this out in the wild. When the animals are down in the valleys, their predators they roam on the ridge tops around there. And they have cover, and so it's a dangerous place for the sheep to be. And even though there's enough water and food to sustain them as they make the trip, there's not enough to sustain them if they just decide to bed down there and not get to the mountaintops that the shepherd has before them. So the sheep were just passing through the valley to get to a better place that the shepherd had prepared for them. And the same thing is true for us. Sometimes, in order for God to get us to a better place, he has to take us through some valleys. And yeah, sometimes those valleys are tough. They're difficult. They're longer than we would like for them to be. But here's the good news. The shepherd knows where he's taken us. He knows the way. He's prepared a better place for us. And so if we'll just stay with him, experience his presence as we go through there, we will get through those valleys and we will get to the better place. The Apostle Paul really takes this principle and he puts it into some different words in a really familiar passage, Romans 8:28. Probably most of you know this one by heart. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good to those who are called according to his purpose. So if we love God, God has promised he will use those valleys to take us to a better place. Right now, some of you here, probably a lot of you here, you're going through some valleys. But the good news is God has you on a path to a mountaintop somewhere. And those mountaintops, in those valleys, they're unique for each one of us. No two of them are really the same. So the length of time that we stay in the valley, what we're going to experience in the valley, it's probably going to be different for each one of us. But the one thing that all those valleys have in common is there is a shepherd who knows the way and who will lead us through them. You know, I consider being the pastor of this church one of those mountaintop experiences in life, at least most of the time, probably like anyone else. But as I look back on my life, I'm glad that God didn't just one day say, Pat, I want you to be a pastor, and I'm going to pluck you up from this mountaintop that you're on now, and I'm going to take you over and plop you on this other mountaintop and make you a pastor. That's not the way it worked. And as I look back now, I'm glad for that because I know that God used some of those valley experiences to make me much more effective as a pastor today. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but let me just say this. About the time that God began to call me to be a pastor, he also took Mary and me and our family through a pretty long valley of some financial woes. The company I worked for went bankrupt, and we went through a period where frankly we didn't have a whole lot of money to live on. But as I look back now, I'm thankful for that because I see that God used that period to kind of test us and to prove what a great God he is and why we could have confidence in him. He did that in a couple different ways. One of the things is that Mary and I had made a commitment that while our kids were young, she was going to stay home and raise the kids. And believe me, the easiest thing for us right then would have been for her to go back to work. We could have used the income. But I think God was testing us to see, you've made this commitment to me. Are you going to follow through with it and trust that I'll take care of you? I think He also used it to test and see if we're going to be faithful to continue to invest in His kingdom. Even though we didn't have a lot of income and we were making very little money, going to see if we're going to still be faithful to invest in His kingdom by giving on a regular basis to our church. And the reason I share that is not to say, man, look what a great job we did, because, man, we failed along the way. But you know what we learned through those experiences? We learned that God is 100% faithful to do what He said He would do, to take care of every single need that we had during that time. All I can tell you is we never missed a house payment. We never missed a meal. We had a car, even if it was for quite a while a Datsun B210 burnt orange that we used to call the Great Pumpkin. But we had a car. And I got to tell you, as I look back now, I have a degree in accounting. And I can't put down on paper, I can't tell you with debits and credits how we ever got through that time financially, other than to say God did it, that He's faithful. And that's why God takes us through some of those valleys, because He wants to bring us to a better place and to understand that we can trust in Him 100%, no matter what that situation is. See, that's because my security is not found in the absence of dangers. It's found in the presence of the shepherd. And experiencing God's presence in those valleys means that I have to always remember that those valleys are just a path to something better. Third thing I have to do, I have to focus on the shepherd's power and not on my problems. Think about it. In David's day, the shepherd didn't have a whole lot. He's out there, especially when they would travel from their homes up to these high places, and they went through the valley. The shepherd had a few provisions, a few meager provisions, a little bit of food, some water. And he had two instruments that he could use, the two that he refers to here in this psalm. First of all, he had a rod. Rod was a little, probably about 2 foot long branch or piece of wood. It had been whittled out of some hard wood. At one end, it had a big knob on it. Sometimes into that knob they would put thorns or nails. And while the rod was occasionally used on the shepherd, it was primarily used as a weapon against the predators that would come against the sheep. It's really interesting. Philip Keller, in his book, he relates how these shepherds would get really good with this rod. They could throw these things a long distance and be very accurate with them. And they would use that to either kill or to scare away the predators that would come after the sheep. It was a picture of the power that the shepherd had. So it's no wonder, it's interesting. Go to the Scriptures and look at all the times where it talks about God's rod. And it's always a picture of His power, and especially about how He exerts His power against God's enemies. So the shepherd had his rod, which is a picture of his power. He also had a staff. Most of you probably know what a shepherd's staff looks like, a long pole with a crook at one end. And the shepherd would use that to guide the sheep, but he would also use it to rescue them. If they got down into a hole, he could take that curved end and pull them out. If they got too close to the edge of a cliff, he could take it and kind of pull it back in. So it was a picture of his rescue, a picture of his guidance in their life. We've already talked a lot about how prone the sheep were to wander off, about how skittish they were, about how they could be frightened by almost anything. So when they went through these valleys, that was the time they needed the presence of the shepherd most. Because that's where most of the dangers were. That's where most of the predators were. That was where the chance they could fall off the edge of a cliff somewhere and be killed. And when the shepherd would come into their presence, and they would see the shepherd's rod and his staff, that's what overcame their fears. That's what overcame the skittishness that they had. You know, earlier on, I shared just a portion of John 16:33, where Jesus promised, in this world you'll have tribulation. But let's look at the whole verse for a moment. Here's the whole verse. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. We forgot that part, didn't we? In the world you'll have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So yeah, you're going to have tribulation, but what does he do? He bookends it with saying that in me you can have peace, and you can have peace because I've overcome the world. Here's what Jesus is saying. Yeah, you can have tribulation in the world, but here's the good news. I'm more powerful in any problem that you have in your life. I'm more powerful in any problem than any fear that you might have in your life. He's more than equipped to deal with whatever dangers we have. He's more than equipped to deal with us when we wander off the path. But the problem is, for us, is that sometimes we get so focused on the problem itself, we get so zeroed in on that we fail to see the shepherd who has the solution to the problem. And when that happens, what do? We go out and we try to fix the problem on our own. And then usually it's only once we've tried everything that we can think of that we finally go back to where we should have began in the first place, into the presence of the shepherd. I got to tell you, when Mary and I first began to have some of those financial struggles, we spent a lot of time looking at our checkbook balance and figuring out how are we going to reduce our expenses, and how are we going to have more income, how are we going to make a budget that could work. And that was frustrating. And it was only when we finally figured out that we needed to get our eyes off the problem, get our eyes onto the shepherd, and trust in him that we were able to have peace in the midst of that. Now, I'm not saying we didn't do some prudent things. I'm not saying that we didn't reduce our expenses, that we didn't go out and I went out and got a whole bunch of part-time jobs for a while. I haven't had to substitute teach. I mean, if you've ever been a substitute teacher, you know you're desperate when you go to be a substitute teacher. But God got us through when we got our eyes on him. God is capable, regardless of what your situation is, in taking you through those valleys. But you have to keep your eyes on him, not on the predators, not on all the other things around you. See, our security is not found in the absence of dangers, but it's found in the presence of the shepherd. And that means I have to keep my eyes on God's power and not on my problem. Finally, one last thing. Don't become isolated. I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but if you go back and you look at Psalm 23, there's a significant change in verse 4. In the first 3 verses, look at the pronouns that David uses to refer to God. He calls them he and him. David's speaking about God. But when he gets in the valleys, look what happens. Now he begins to call God you and use the pronoun your. He quits speaking about God and he starts talking to God. I don't think that's any accident at all. I think what David found is when you get in those valleys, that's the time when you need God most of all. That's the time that you need to draw closest to him. And yet, I think from what I've seen, and even from my own personal experience sometimes, we have a tendency when we get into these valleys to just withdraw from God and to withdraw from other people. I think when we start focusing on the problem itself and we try to fix it and everything, we kind of start to drift away from God and drift away from God at the time that we need to be closest to him the very most. The other thing that we have a tendency to do is we tend to isolate ourselves from God's people. I don't know why. I got to think there's an element of pride in there somewhere that somehow we don't want other people to see that we just don't quite have it all together. Or that we can't handle things on our own. But you know what? That's exactly the opposite of what we need to do. Think about the sheep in the flock. Which of the sheep do the wolves get? They get the ones that stray away from the flock and try to go out and handle things on their own, don't they? It's the sheep who stay within within the flock that are most protected. And that ought to be the case for us. There's a reason there's all these one another verses in the Bible. They're not just there by accident. God put them there because we need each other. We need God and we need each other. And the time we need that the most is usually when we're going through those valleys. So we need to really be careful not to isolate ourselves. See, true security is not found in the absence of dangers. It's found in the presence of the shepherd. And it's also found in the presence of the flock and being around other believers as well. So what are you afraid of this morning? What valleys are you going through right now? What valleys can you maybe see out there on the horizon? I want you to think for a moment. How would your life be different if you faced those fears, having 100% confidence in the shepherd, having 100% confidence that he loves you, and that he's taken you through these valleys to a better place that he's prepared for you? How different would your life be if you knew for sure that he was protecting you and guiding you through those valleys? Here's the good news. You can have that assurance. You can have it right now, right where we are. And here's what we're going to do. I want to take a really practical step just to help you to cement this into your mind this morning. I'm going to give you a few moments to pray through verse 4 that we looked at this morning. And I know for some of you, this whole idea of praying through Scripture might be something that's a little bit different than what you're used to. So I'm going to kind of give you an illustration of how you might do that this morning. Let's just take the first phrase here in this verse. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Now here's how there's a lot of different ways to pray this back to God, but here's how you might begin. God, you've said in your word that there will be valleys in my life. And God, here's the valley that I'm going through right now. Just name it to God. Say, God, here's the valley that I'm going through. And then thank God for bringing that valley into your life, because you know that he's going to use that to bring you to a better place. And you can do that kind of with each phrase as you go through there. I think the phrase you probably want to linger on the most is that phrase where it talks about that God is with me. And just thank God for being with you as you go through those valleys right now. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes just to write where you are, just to read. You've got the verse there in your outline. You can look at it in your Bible. But just take a few moments just to pray through that verse for a little bit. And thank God for those valleys. Thank him for his presence. Thank him for his power and his guidance that he shows you with his rod and his staff. So go ahead and take a few moments. Just bow your heads right now and go ahead and take a few moments just to pray this morning.